Welcome back with a smiling face. Links to previous episodes are given in the video description, so don't forget to like, subscribe and share the video. Echoes of Shattered Destiny. Episode 19. Chapter 144 to 152. I barely remembered running into the forest even though I had little red marks speckling my face and arms from how fast I'd been going. Branches both barren and full of leaves slapped at my skin, but the proof of it faded within seconds. Her scent was faint, but I followed the thread until it withered away in my hands. The shadows scurried into the darkest corners of the forest, retreating farther with every step I took. I had just noticed it when the sound of a wet gasp sounded from close by. The sight of her face, and the paleness of her skin as she lay sprawled out in the grass nearly sent me into shock. My mind was shutting down my senses one at a time until I could make sense of reality. There was one thing alone that propelled me forwards, making me stumble and scrape my knees as I fell at her side. It was the slow thud of her heart and the way her lips formed a small smile as her eyes focused on me. I didn't hesitate as I tore her shirt open and yanked down her tank top, but the weeping stab wound above her chest had a sob catching in my throat. "Goddess, Brianna! Why did you come out this far?" I whispered and pressed my shirt against her chest, barely recalling when I took it off. I saw my wolf," she croaked and licked her dry lips, which were now coated with a sheen of blood. I tried to shush her, but the words tumbled from her lips. She looked different. I stared down at my hands and remembered the glow that had taken over Rowena's. She could use her magic to heal, which meant I could do the same. Maya didn't speak the truth that lingered between us, that I might not be able to heal like Rowena could. Still, there was no other option. Rowena was too far away, and Brianna had minutes, possibly even seconds left. There was no one that could help us in time. It was up to me, which meant there was no room for failure. I threw my blood-soaked shirt across the grass and flattened my palms against her chest, trying to picture my own glow radiating from my skin. When that didn't work, I closed my eyes and clawed at that smoky substance entangled with my soul. I came up with nothing but the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears, and the anguish that came with failure. "Lola," her voice was so quiet. The sound of it held my heart in a vice grip and clenched with every raspy breath she took. I told her to be quiet, to let me fix this. Her blood coated my hands, and for once my stomach revolted at the sight. I couldn't stand the look in her eyes, or the tear that trailed down her cheek because we both knew that I couldn't fix this. A branch snapped a few feet away, deep within the darkness of the forest. A sense of awareness tickled my spine, the same one I felt when that witch broke into our home. Anger swelled in my chest, dark and pulsating like the shadows that watched with caution. I thought I could feel them hiding, responding to my rage as I screamed and snarled into the night. "Come out, you coward!" I didn't care who could hear me, or how many there were. All I knew was that if her heart stopped, everyone involved would die. "You want me? Come and get me!" I screamed until the feeling of being watched faded, until I knew we were truly alone. "Lola, it's all right," Brianna's eyes were clear as they stared into mine, but it was the understanding in her voice that broke a piece of me I hadn't known existed. The loss made me realize how far I was truly willing to go for the people I loved. "The FK it is!" I snarled. Using my birthright, I stared through the darkness and called on the shadows that hid within it. With every ounce of force possible, I summoned them to my side. It wasn't just rage I felt when they ignored me. It was betrayal. The bravest inched a few feet forwards, but only to get a better look. Still hidden within the dark, I could feel their anxiety and their hesitation. Not a single whisper filled the air, and not one dared to come close. Why aren't you listening to me? I want to make a deal with you. I screamed into the night and felt their answer in the way they retreated. Their cowardice stoked my anger, morphing the emotion into a lightning storm that raged in my chest. I screamed with each crack of electricity, until my throat grew hoarse, and I tasted the metallic tang of blood. My heart and head had been cracked open, and everything good and safe was removed. It left my morals scrambled until I wasn't sure I cared what was right anymore. You took her, Wolf. I laughed, and the sound was every bit as unhinged as I felt. You took the only thing she had to protect herself, and now you won't come and save her? No. Save her, heal her. I'll pay whatever price you want. Brianna took what I somehow knew was her last gurgling breath. A current skated over my skin, raising the hairs along my arms and neck as I screamed, "Save her! Life! Now!" I wasn't fast enough to cover my head when every shadow lurking within the forest swarmed us. A dense fog void of color surrounded us, very much sentient, and watching. They encompassed Brianna until she vanished from my sight, until the entire forest vanished from sight. They were all around me, and I could feel their ire as if it were my own. If they had answered me, had listened to my call, I might have cared about their feelings. The only thing I cared about currently was the girl I had known since I was a child, who accepted my half-assed apology for turning into a BH and became the best friend I desperately needed. Seconds passed in silence, and just as quickly as they lunged, they slunk back into the cover of the forest. I didn't know what they did to her, nor did I care. All that mattered was the wound on her chest was gone, leaving behind smooth skin. They took every drop the blood that trickled from her body, which they were lucky to have devoured considering I had to beg for their help. Brianna was unconscious, but lifting her into my arms was easy enough. If I wasn't furious and running on the fumes of my fading adrenaline, I would have found the sight of her tall frame in my arms comical. My anger made the shadows restless, which was something that never happened before. They were voyeurs, watching until they were called, never affected by what went on in the world around them. It was unusual that my emotions invoked a reaction. The shadows followed us as I carried her through the forest, but didn't dare get too close, even with my back turned. We had just reached the backyard when her eyes fluttered open, making my determined pace falter. My hero, I wasn't sure if I were amazed or annoyed that she had the audacity to laugh after almost DG. Giovanni would certainly tear her a new one for venturing so far into the forest at night, but that wasn't why I decided to cut her some slack. "I'll pay whatever price you want." I made that promise so effortlessly, knowing all too well how dark their requests could get. Not only that, but I'd never seen the shadows act this way before. There was no telling what price I had paid, just like there was no telling what they'd done to Brianna. I stayed with Brianna all night, and not because Maddox practically vanished into thin air. Even when Giovanni stormed into the house and swept her up in his arms, I remained at her side. Nearly 3 hours later I got a mind link from Sean and Mason, who had watched as Maddox barreled through the pack's territory lines chasing after a cloaked figure. Another hour passed before Maddox's voice slid into my thoughts, which after careful deliberation I decided to ignore. I could still hear what he was saying, so I knew he was safe and sound, but that didn't change the fact that he had blocked me off during his wild goose chase through the forest. Lola, I was right on her trail. I gave him the chance to explain himself only because he showed up at the house Brianna and Giovanni were staying at. "Then where is she?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended, but exhaustion had long ago consumed me. Did ignoring me, and risking your life to run miles out of the pack's boundaries get you the witch? She got away, but it wasn't for nothing. The place that they gather, it's north of the boundaries. I'm sure of it. He took my sour attitude in stride, but no amount of understanding would melt the chip on my shoulder. When he tried to pull me into his arms, I placed a hand against his chest. What you did wasn't okay, Maddox. I told him, forcing myself to remain strong even though the flash of hurt in his eyes felt like a punch to the gut. I dropped my hand and leaned into his chest as his arms wrapped around my waist. You know, things would be very different if I was the one who vanished for hours on end, ignoring your mind links to chase after a witch. Lola, I could taste his apology and the sincerity behind it, since Maddox's pride sometimes kept him from owning up to his mistakes, but I wasn't finished getting my point across. You're an alpha, which makes you more protective than most, but I won't have you lock me away just to run onto the battlefield by yourself. I told him, feeling a spark crackle in my chest as my words rang true. I have the strength, the speed, and now the magic to help end this. Hiding me from danger won't save this pack, it'll be the avalanche that kills us all. Chapter 145. It wasn't the sunlight streaming through open CS that woke me, but Beta Drake's gruff baritone. His voice d'd out the steady thud of Maddox's heart, which was right below where my head was resting. Lola, are you with Maddox right now? My spine protested angrily as I rolled off Maddox's chest, which I had been sprawled across seconds ago, and plopped down on the floor. The last thing I remembered was being wrapped in his arms, letting his warmth and strength flow into me as I told him how Brianna almost died. I didn't want to tell him what I'd done. There wasn't a single part of me that regretted it, not once. I saw the look of pure relief in Giovanni's eyes and knew how close he had been to snapping, but I was still ashamed and horrified. There was no telling what or who they would take. Instead of saying the words out loud, I let Maddox relieve every agonizing second through our bond. Every emotion I felt and word I had screamed echoed in our heads, ending seconds after Brianna's last gurgled breath when the shadows swarmed us. Maddox's arms tightened around me, and his stubble-coated cheek grazed my face, but he said nothing. I preferred it this way, listening to the sound of him breathing instead of false reassurances. There was a price to be paid, and when the time came, I'd have no choice but to accept it. I was halfway asleep when Maddox said, Brianna wasn't wounded when I ran past her. If she was, I wouldn't have left her there. You said you chased the witch past the pack boundaries. I frowned, cracking an eye open to stare up at him. I felt the witch last night, hiding in the forest. She was watching Brianna and I, but she left before the shadows, you know. There are two witches messing with us last night, I was sure of it. Surprisingly, I slept like a rock after that. I could have taken it as a good sign, but instead I saw it as an omen. My mind couldn't conjure up a nightmare that was more frightening than reality. She is. Maddox replied to Drake, smirking when I turned and caught him watching me. Why, what's up? There was another MR. You both need to come down here now, like right now. Here turned out to be in the center of town, right out front of the university. Local and campus police did their jobs, securing the scene until Maddox and I arrived. We had Cordelia and Rowena wait in the car when we saw the growing crowd pressing at the boundaries of the caution tape. It wasn't the nature of the MR that had Drake sounding so on edge, but the identity of the victim and the location. They were both specifically chosen, that much was crystal clear. In the large courtyard that led up to the main entrance of the university, right where the bake sale had been hosted only 10 hours ago, was the mutilated body of Devin Armstrong. It was clear he died the same way as Carson, with his throat slit and his torso littered with deep gashes. The only difference was the damage to Devin's body was significantly worse than Carson's. There were so many wounds along his chest and abdomen that his entrails were showing. That was the tipping point for all of us, I think. Brianna, who insisted she come even though she had nearly died last night, was puking her breakfast into the grass. Sean mumbled something about comforting her and went to hold her hair back. I noticed how he kept his head turned far away from Devon's body, and his chest moved rapidly with each deep breath he took. I forced myself to look away from his accusatory eyes that followed me even in DH. There were people in the crowd with the same look on their faces, each one staring at me. Out of the 2 times I had spoken to Devon Armstrong, both ended in very public arguments. He hadn't been shy speaking out against me and the vampires, or in claiming there were others who shared his opinion. What made this MR different wasn't that the body had been moved, but that it had been moved into the center of town. There were busy intersections on either side of the university, with little traffic cameras perched on top. The patch of grass where Devon sat, propped up against the school sign, was directly within the camera's view. Maddox and Zeke were already making plans to go downtown to review the footage in a few hours, but first we needed to track down the true location of Devon's MR. Go ahead of us, take Rowena and Cordelia with you too. People shouldn't follow if they see I'm still here. I told Maddox, but it was impossible to hide the sourness in my voice through Mind Link. Besides, I want a closer look at Devon's body. It doesn't make sense that Brianna was attacked by the witches last night, only for Devon to turn up MD. We know the truth, and so do the people closest to us. It doesn't matter what anyone else says. When this is over and they're safe with their families, everyone will know who was responsible. His eyes found mine, soft and comforting even though we were feet apart and surrounded by other people. Maddox left 10 minutes later with Zeke in tow, while Brianna remained glued to my side. You saved my life, which means I'm never leaving your side again. She said adamantly, but quickly added, except for when I leave to visit Joe's family, but other than that, consider me your indentured servant. I don't need an indentured servant. Even though my voice was stern, Brianna couldn't help but grin. She hesitated when I approached Devon's corpse and let out a nervous chuckle. I think knowing when to give you some alone time is a quality every indentured servant should have, right? Without giving me enough time to answer, she turned on her heel and wobbled over to Sean, whose face was just as green as hers. My stomach turned as I knelt beside Devon's corpse. Even though the scent of blood was one I now associated with food, it was the amount of the sweet-smelling substance that made me completely repulsed. Something white caught my eye. The color was so bright against the backsplash of blood and guts that I couldn't help but notice it. I called the coroner over and asked for a pair of tweezers, then proceeded to hold my breath while I dug into Devon's shredded chest cavity. Dark spots speckled my vision, but I refused to take a breath. Only when the piece of folded paper slid past his ribcage did I finally sk in a large gust of oxygen. There was a waxy coating on the paper, probably to keep the blood from soaking into it. The light-headed feeling only lasted a few seconds but was replaced by the sensation of falling when I peeled back the corners to see what was written inside. Made you look. My eyes darted from the paper to where it had been lodged inside of Devon's chest cavity, right where his heart was. I gave the note to the police and watched as they slipped it into an evidence bag. Rage coated my tongue in a metallic-tasting film and made the blood rush to my head. Several deep breaths later and there was zero relief. I was seconds away from darting into the forest to chase Maddox and Zeke down, when I detected Brandon's voice above the static in my head. What, Cass? You stood me up last night? I could tell from his languid voice and pissy tone that he was currently sweating off a hangover. I snickered inwardly when Cassidy laughed and said, "Oh, don't boo-hoo. You were probably halfway up some schoolgirl's skirt. Besides, you're just jealous I had a date of my own." Shaggy hair, a keyed motorcycle, and a pair of scuffed boots popped in my head, obliterating the storm that I'd been brewing. Giving the coroner the go-ahead to move Devon's body, I headed to the yellow caution tape that kept everyone off the grass. Rather than stand on the sidewalk, they crowded the street, so a few of the police officers had to redirect traffic. It was the warriors that formed a radius around the university a few blocks out and kept pedestrians from getting close. The only people allowed in were the ones that lived here, everyone else was turned away. From the chatter I heard between students in the crowd, classes had been cancelled for the rest of the week. The thought of Lars taking Cassidy anywhere twisted my stomach into knots, which momentarily distracted me from the sleek sports car pulling up beside the curb. Everyone watching had no choice but to move from the street, and more than one found themselves jutted in the rear end by a bumper. A head of salt and pepper hair, thick but professionally styled, appeared from the driver's side. His suit screamed luxury from the varnished gold cufflinks to the $500 Stefano tie. I knew absolutely nothing about men's fashion, but I had seen a few in Maddox's closet, attached to suits he's claimed to have never worn. At the time, I made him promise I'd get to see him with one on. He had a mountainous build like many werewolves, so he towered over me as he sliced through the caution tape and snarled, "Where is my son?" Chapter 146. The moment the caution tape fluttered to the ground, Sean and Mason were at my back. Brianna was there too, and I had to resist the urge to raise my eyebrows when I spotted the knife she had hidden in her hand. I noticed the resemblance between him and Devon the moment he came up close. They had the same arched eyebrows and thin lips that made them look perpetually angry all of the time. When I first found out Devon was the son of a judge, I had hoped the poor attitude wasn't genetic. "I'm Luna, I know who you are," Judge Clint Armstrong snapped, his voice sharp like razor blades. I held back my irritation since it was his son that was MD, but the venom in his voice sounded far beyond that of a grieving father. "I asked you a question, girl." I had seen DHS many faces, suffered through so much loss, and stepped into a role I wasn't sure I could handle, all to be called a girl. It was Maya that couldn't bite her tongue and swallow the insult, because for her there was nothing more abhorrent than disregarding a werewolf's title. It grated on her nerves, and my willpower alone could only do so much to hold her back. Only because I can't imagine the pain of losing a child will I ignore the ridiculous amount of disrespect you've shown me, but I trust that in the future you'll show some restraint and never do that again. I kept my voice low, because the last thing I wanted was an audience looking in on this man's pain. His eyes grew bright with murderous rage, and within an instant the emotion was smothered by a mask of civility. I couldn't help but wonder if he had been a lawyer before claiming the role of a judge. "Of course, Luna." He corrected himself, his tone flat but civil. It wouldn't have raised anyone else's alarms, but mine were playing a steady tune that reminded me of A.F.L. Dirge. Both Mason and Sean nodded as I met their eyes, picking up on my silent command. "I'll have my friends here take you where you need to be, and either Maddox or myself will be in contact with you today." The three of them walked off, but the sting of Clint Armstrong's anger still lingered in my bones. "Hey, Lola!" I heard Cassidy shout from the street, but another man had also chosen that moment to speak up, and he was much closer to where I stood than she was. "What did you do to his son?" "I saw that DD boy over there." "That how you vampires feed?" "No one started DG here till you came around." A middle-aged man whose scowl was framed by rectangular glasses and a patchy beard shoved to the very front of the crowd. I couldn't help but notice that even though the caution tape was shredded in half, he didn't dare step past where it lay on the ground. Others in the crowd shifted uneasily, but all stood silent and watched. This wasn't unusual, having to defend yourself in front of the pack. There would always be other wolves picking fights for dominance, just like there would always be a victor. Don't be. Brianna came to my defense, but the man wasn't having it. Why should we listen to you? You're one of their whores. After you're done giving them your blood, do you give them your pee? I made no effort to stop Brianna as she cocked her fist back and punched him in the face. Blood erupted from the man's nose, coating his shirt and the grass at his feet. A string of curses and insults spewed from his mouth, and his eyes glittered with unrepressed hatred. Instead of making him back off, he made a wild grab for Brianna. A hand clamped down on the man's shoulder, making him wince. Attached to that hand, with a bored and irritable look on his face, was Brandon. He dug his fingers into the man's shoulder and spun him around. Let's go, before my brother comes back and you join today's list of dearly departed. He grunted, his lack of sensitivity somehow unsurprising. Nice punch, girl. Cassidy grinned at Brianna, but the expression slipped when her eyes focused on the crime scene in the background. Her cheeks lost their rosy flush. Oh goddess, what happened? Was it another one? Unfortunately. I nodded, Devon Armstrong. There was no harm in telling her, not when the entire pack would know in a matter of hours. Oh, I can't say I was fond of him, but that's still unfortunate. Are you two still coming to training today? It's the start of the new season, so we're getting assigned our partners for the summer. She wrinkled her nose. I mean, if you can with everything going on. Goddess, I sound self-centered, don't I? Not at all. Brianna shook her head, her expression too serious to be anything other than teasing. She looked at me and excitement exploded in her eyes. Maybe we can be partners. There was a lot going on, and adding training to my already hectic schedule looked to be a terrible idea, but it was the one thing other than lying in bed all day with Maddox, which relieved any sort of stress. I'll make sure I'm there. I just have a few things to do today. I promised not only the two of them, but myself. The place where Devon lost his life was deep within the forest. An obvious trail of blood, guts, and disheveled dirt led us to where Maddox and Zeke were standing. Sean had tagged along to join the warriors, setting up a perimeter around the patch of forest, to keep any curious wolves from venturing too far. Mason told him he'd catch up and followed Brianna and I deeper into the forest. Brianna made a sound of interest when she spotted Rowena and Cordelia, who were both hovering around the giant patch of blood on the ground, most likely searching for the barest trace of magic. As she and Zeke get to talking about magic, I focused my attention on Maddox. 15 minutes and you get yourself into trouble. He shook his head, only half teasing. Try again. Brianna's the one who punched him in the face. I snorted and jabbed my finger into left pectoral. Brianna's conversation with Zeke came to a halt, and she stared at me with surprise in her eyes. I winked at her and added, with my express permission, of course. What about Clint Armstrong? Maddox asked, his eyebrow lifted. Clint Armstrong is grieving the MR of his son and has been thoroughly put in his place. I promised him, but the flicker of animalistic fury in his eyes made me pause. The strange emotion made his pupils grow and the golden tones shrink. I narrowed my eyes, I mean it. He's been punished enough. Just when I thought that flicker might turn into a full-born forest fire, it vanished. Maddox smirked softly. Yes, Luna. My heart skipped a beat, and some of my earlier irritation faded. I gave him a look I knew he could decipher and asked, how's everything going? They're still searching for any traces of magic. Maddox grunted, crossing his arms over his broad chest as he watched the witches at work. His eyes veered down to my level and softened. I planned on running this by you later, but it looks like we're both going to be busy today. Zeke and I were talking about getting a small group of warriors together and heading up to where I lost track of the witch. There has to be a meet-up close by. I smirked as his thoughts curled around mine, soft and sensual. Are you asking me for permission, Alpha? If I were, what would you say? He asked, tilting his head. I'd say yes, under one condition. If you find their hideout, you don't go in alone. You come back and get me, maybe even Giovanni and Tristan. He nodded. Observation only. I lost myself in my thoughts, torn between wanting to go with Maddox and needing to remain here. There was so much that needed to be done, especially now that I had my magic. Cordelia and Rowena both warned me it would start manifesting itself now that the bind was gone, and the longer I took to master it, the more damage it could do. After we're finished here, I'm dropping by the police station to watch the traffic tapes. Care to tag along? Maddox asked minutes after we both had gone silent watching the witch's work. I can't. I sighed, trying not to think about my full schedule today. After this I'm meeting with a couple therapists for Holly, and I have training today, witch training and warrior training. We have people who can find a suitable therapist for Holly. He frowned and his eyebrows inched closer together. I know, I just want to do this myself. I feel like I owe her that much. I admitted and watched as he visibly smothered the reluctance hidden in his golden eyes. Really, it's right outside of town. Well within the PAX borders, and it'll be the middle of the day. I don't think actually, I was planning to head up that way too. Mason chimed in, a dimpled smile on his face. I narrowed my eyes at him, but everything Mason did seemed genuine. You mind giving me a lift? I raised my eyebrow at Maddox, waiting to see if he had any complaints. When he said nothing, I nodded at Mason. I wouldn't mind at all. Rowena's soft sigh hit my ears, and I turned in time to see her disappointed frown. She brushed the dirt off her hands and flexed her fingers before walking over. I'm afraid I can't feel anything. It was the troubled look on her face that gave me reason to pause. There was a twisting in my stomach that told me there was something much more important weighing on her mind. That worries you a lot? I stated, feeling a twinge of guilt at how blunt I sounded even though I knew Rowena could handle it. Still, there were now 2 werewolves DD. The time for niceties was over. I'd like to know why. I'm pleased to see your magic is working. Have you felt it stir yet? It should be more potent than the random thoughts and feelings you pick up. Her lips lifted into a smile, and somehow I knew she wouldn't answer my question until I answered hers. I've felt it stir, but I don't think I've actually used it yet. I replied. She nodded, but the pleased look on her face was fleeting. Natural magic has to do with the body and its life force. That's why I'm skilled at healing and uncovering things hidden or repressed. Humans, vampires, and werewolves aren't the only beings with a life force. Other animals have them, even plants. The earth is just one big life force, which means I should feel something, but both times I've come up empty-handed. I looked over at the patch of grass, noting how dark it looked compared to what was untouched. It was like a part of the earth had died. You felt no life force, even in the ground? I asked, hoping I was simply misunderstanding. The moment the thought popped into existence, a feeling of dread filled my insides. Absolutely nothing. Cordelia's gasp was a whip that cracked through the silence, splitting it in two and replacing it with a tension that made me feel oddly claustrophobic surrounded by all these trees. The forest was my second home, and not once had I felt the desire to run from it as far and fast as I could. Brianna clapped a hand over her mouth to stifle the yelp she almost let out, and even Zeke had a hand placed against his heart. Cordelia's eyes were wide and her face unbelievably pale. The hand she cradled to her chest was coated in dark, glossy blood. Her voice trembled when she said, "I need something to wipe this off, quickly, please." Perhaps it was the urgency in her voice, but I was seconds away from pulling my own shirt off when Maddox beat me to it. She nodded a hasty thank you and vigorously rubbed the old blood from her hand. Whoever did this, they were in a hurry. It's messy than the first time, and more magic was left behind. I couldn't read on its pattern, but there was something else I picked up. Cordelia closed her eyes and took a calming breath. When they opened, acceptance burned in their depths. I had no clue what it could have meant, and quickly forgot seeing it when she swallowed and said, "These aren't just murders, they're sacrifices." Chapter 147. Sacrifices, I said for the third time, narrowing my eyes as I followed the curvy back road in the new car Maddox reluctantly loaned me. The red-haired witch, doesn't she know how to do blood magic? Mason asked, refusing to let me stew in silence. She really can't think of a reason for these sacrifices. She doesn't know much blood magic. It runs in her family, but they don't practice it themselves. I explained. I just wanted Holly to know where she comes from. As much as she can, anyway. I hated having control over Holly's life. Making decisions for her, forcing her to see a therapist, it made me feel like she was a prisoner and not part of the pack. I didn't want to make her feel how our father did, like pretty bird shoved into a cage, left to rot as it sang itself. Only one other person truly knew how I felt, and it was Tristan. The sour vampire seemed like the only person able to get through to Holly. It made me feel marginally better that Tristan and I agreed on one thing vehemently. The soft-spoken, raven-haired girl I now called my sister could never, ever meet the woman that birthed her, the world's most powerful blood witch and the one coming for my head. My thoughts drifted to Lars and those scuffed boots of his. At one point I'd been positive he had something to do with all of this, but now I wasn't sure. The more I let my mind wander, the easier it was to convince myself that it wasn't his specific pair of boots I had seen. A jolt shot down my spine, electrifying my nerves as it forced my attention back onto the road. I'd been following a sharp curve when a figure darted out of a cut in the forest. My heart seized in my chest as I yanked the wheel to the side and sent us careening out of the way. Instinctively, I slammed my foot into the brake, which sent Mason and I flying forwards. Panic lodged itself in my throat, growing larger until only a sliver of oxygen could pass through. Lars's hand froze midway from where he stood on the shoulder. Even though my heart still raced from shock, he hadn't caused the emotion currently choking me. For a split second, day was replaced by night. There was no Mason by my side, no help or rescue on the way, yet I wasn't alone. Only those scuffed boots kept me company, but they were also the countdown to my DH. "Are you all right, Lola?" Mason asked, his voice low. The sound of his concern sucked me right out of my thoughts. "I am really beginning to hate driving," I replied through clenched teeth, tightening my grip on the steering wheel to keep my hands from trembling. It took every ounce of patience within me not to jump out of the car and strangle Lars. What mostly stopped me was the lingering thought that he could somehow be involved. "Luna, you tryin' to kill me?" Lars asked, his arm resting on the roof of the car. There wasn't a hint of amusement on my face. "What are you doing here, Lars?" I deadpanned. "Bike broke down, can you believe it?" He shook his head, and I was surprised to see he looked a bit pained. A second later the emotion vanished, replaced by his usual charming grin. "I got a buddy just inside town who's got a shop, he can put my bike in his truck. I'll be forever indebted to you if you give me a ride." That's supposed to make me want to help you. When his lower lip jutted out in a less than effective pout, I started to roll the window up. All right, I'll behave. He held his hands up in surrender. I promise, just give me a lift. Get in the car, Lars. The first 5 minutes were quiet, but there was a tension building that I swore I wasn't imagining. Lars seemed completely at ease, his arms draped across the back seat like we were his personal chauffeurs. The voice of curiosity in my head, which sounded suspiciously like Maya, poked and prodded me with all the questions that needed answering. The feeling became so overwhelming that there was no stopping myself from asking the first and least suspicious thing on my mind. What brought you all the way out here? There was just the right amount of disinterest in my voice to make it seem like I was being polite or trying to break up the silence. That buddy I mentioned has some property. He lets me park my camper there. He replied, watching the passing evergreens through the window. You're that torn up over your bike. It was a bold assumption, one I knew was spot on when he scoffed and took it as a personal offense. If you knew how much time and money I put into her, you'd understand. Some of those parts took months to come in, and I'm still paying them off. She's in perfect shape, makes no sense why the engine seized. He grumbled, but I was only half listening because Maddox's deep voice began to rumble in my head. Zeke and I just went through the tapes, and there's something you need to see. If you've got a minute, I need you to scan through what I watched. There was a witness, someone walking down the block, but that's not all. It's easier if you see for yourself. The picture wasn't the greatest, but it's not anyone I recognized. Before we release the image to the public, I want another set of eyes I trust. Sure, give me a minute. I told Maddox, and quickly followed the directions Lars provided until I turned down a narrow dirt road that ended at a refurbished barn. I could see why his friend lets him keep his camper here. The guy had just about every other mode of transportation sitting around the barn. There was nearly a dozen rusted cars, a few street bikes, and even a four-wheeler or two. I even spotted a tractor-trailer that had seen better days. What I didn't see was the camper Lars mentioned. I thought you said you parked your camper here. I typically do. Last couple of nights I've been camping in the woods. He nodded at the barn. You can drop me off here. He's bound to be lurking around somewhere. Lars got out of the car and peered through Mason's open window. I couldn't tell if the smile that tugged on his lips was sinister or if he was just trying to flirt again. Either way, it did nothing to quell the bad feeling brewing in my stomach. Thanks for the ride, Luna. He winked. With his hands in the pockets of his jeans, he whistled a tune under his breath and headed in the direction of the barn. It replayed itself in my head while the scent of dirt and machine oil clung to my nose. Even with the windows down and the crisp breeze passing through, the smell lingered. Ready when you are. I mind-linked Maddox, steering the car onto the shoulder of the main road. As his thoughts filled my head, I closed my eyes and allowed myself to slip into the memory. 4 grey walls stood on all sides, far enough apart to allow room for a desk, computer, and 2 bulky alphas. Stale coffee and a mixture of cologne stained the air. Displayed on the monitor was a grainy image of where Devon's body had been found. Just across the street, walking in the opposite direction, was a figure. Zeke's profile came into view, his smoky eyes narrowed as he clicked a few buttons on the computer. It was dark outside when the surveillance video began to play, but the street lamps along the road illuminated every corner of the screen. There was no hiding from the light, or at least I thought there wasn't. A blurry figure came into frame and one by one the street lamps went out. Rewind the video to the exact moment they came into view. I told him and waited until RKR came back into view. The picture wasn't the greatest, but what I thought had been a low-quality camera was actually a cloak wrapped around the KRS body. There were no discernible features visible, even determining their gender was impossible. They were just a mass of darkness, one dragging the corpse of Devon Armstrong. The video resumed, and exactly 3 minutes and 27 seconds later, the street lamps flicked back on. A steady throb started in the back of my head as my eyes scoured the screen from top to bottom. It wasn't Devon's freshly placed corpse that had me breaking the mind link and forcing the car into drive, but the witness I now knew I recognized. "Lola, what?" Mason cried out and clutched the door, but that did little to hold him in place as I spun the car around and took off fast enough to make the tires squeal. His face paled and then turned green as I hit the sharp turns, slowly letting off the gas to keep us from flying off the side of the mountain. I could feel Maddox's voice rattling in my skull, but the sound of my pulse and the throbbing in my head was far louder. I shot down the narrow dirt road, not once slowing even though the dust kicked up was impossible to see through. Pebbles bounced off the hood and windshield, one leaving a crack the size of my pinky. The car jerked, and a masculine scream rang in my ears as I flattened the brake against the floor. The tires locked, sending us sliding across the dirt before coming to a complete stop, inches away from the side of the barn. Both Mason and Maddox's voices joined the low ringing in my ears as I shoved open the door and clambered to my feet. "You've got to be kidding me." The grittiness of dirt hit my tongue when I opened my mouth and snarled. Slowly I turned, narrowing my eyes to try and peer through the thick wall of evergreens that surrounded us and the barn. There wasn't the faintest sound or scent of Lars, only the eerie silence of a vacant forest. The sour feeling in my gut was confirmation enough, our only suspect and witness was gone in the wind. Chapter 148. Quit sulking. Mason scolded me from the driver's seat. "If you wanted to drive, you shouldn't have tried to drive us off the cliff." "That's not what I was trying to do, and I already apologized." I griped and folded my arms over my chest. "You're just angry I made you scream." The trees that grew out of the rocky cliffside whooshed by in shades of shamrock and olive. I wondered if Lars were in there somewhere, deep within their protective cover. Were the witches there too? "You didn't make me scream, your reckless driving did." His voice had an edge of defensiveness that made me snort. Warm hazel eyes slid over to where I sat in the passenger. "You won't tell anyone about this, right?" "I won't." I reassured him, and waited until relief flooded his eyes to say, "If you let me drive us back, and you can't act like I'm going to drive off the mountain with every curve." "Deal, but you keep this to yourself for as long as you live." He narrowed his eyes. "Deal." I nodded and began to relax in the seat when a thought crossed my mind. "I can tell Brianna, right?" "Yeah, you can tell Brianna." His eyes warmed when he chuckled, and his tone implied he'd been expecting me to ask as much. Our banter dwindled until silence took over, sending my eyes veering back towards the forest and my thoughts to a certain slippery werewolf. I'd been sorely tempted to mention my suspicion regarding Lars's boots, but Maddox was already putting out a pack-wide memo. Soon every werewolf on our land would be on the lookout for Lars, which meant there was no need to turn it into a manhunt. Still, I had to tell him eventually, I just needed more time. I tried to think of where Lars might have gone but came up with nothing. The most I could do was scour the woods and search for his elusive friend, which I was considering when another thought popped into my head. Cassidy, she's going on a date with him. Even though I made the mental note to talk with her after training, it didn't ease the dark cloud that loomed over my head for the remainder of the day. After a quick search of the clinics in the area, I found a small privately owned practice that had an abundance of positive reviews. Mind-linking one of the therapists was the fastest route of communication, and by far the most awkward. Maddox promised slipping into the pack members' minds would become easier over time, but I was still a non-believer. A girl could only handle so many horrified shrieks. The worst of it is when they're in private and in their shock unwillingly send me mental images of things I definitely shouldn't be seeing. The private practice was nestled right in the middle of town. Located in an off-white colonial house whose cobalt blue shutters were a cheerful beacon from halfway down the street. The 3 licensed therapists that made up the little practice were pleasant, even though one had to turn down the offer when her client stormed into the building, face smeared with heavy makeup. Her wet sobs filled the room, warping her words as she flailed her hands dramatically to get her point across. "I understand, Selena. Come on, let's talk about it in my office," the fair-haired therapist said soothingly and guided the trembling girl past us with a comforting hand on her shoulder. I locked eyes with the sobbing teenage girl and managed a small but encouraging smile when she waved and stumbled over a hello. Well, I assumed that's what it was since she couldn't exactly form the words. Her wailing continued once the door closed, though it was muffled. One of the remaining therapists, a dark-haired male whose wire-rimmed glasses made him look shrewd and analyzing, seemed more than willing to drop a client or two for the Luna's younger sister. I might have hired him off his resume alone if it weren't for the onyx shade of his hair and the severe way he pursed his lips, both of which reminded me of my father. If the sight could send me tumbling backwards through time, back to that battlefield, then I wondered what it would do to Holly. I went with his colleague instead, a middle-aged she-wolf with a kind smile who introduced herself as Dr. Mayfield. When she wasn't at the local hospital acting as in-house psychiatrist, she took a handful of clients here at the house. Her resume was just as impressive and revealed that she'd been helping people heal for over a decade. I could see the full extent of her history written all over her face. It was tattooed within the fine lines around her eyes and mouth and hid beneath every inch of her bronze skin. Magic and vampirism certainly play into your sister's experiences, but I've found that no matter how complex a situation is, it can always be deconstructed into something easier to SW. Dr. Mayfield said kindly. There was a look of understanding on her face that made me feel like Holly's demons might not be so undefeatable after all. I left Dr. Mayfield with Tristan's contact information and rushed to make it to training on time. Mason kept up his end of the deal, even if he did look a bit pale every time I hit a sharp turn. Even after stopping at home for a change of clothes, I made it to training before Brianna. Mason supplied the directions since had training as well, only his was in a different class. Shame we won't be partners this time around. Can't say I miss getting me kicked. Mason's cheeky grin revealed the dimples he tried hard to hide, the same ones I watched girls swoon over. We had just pulled into the parking space when I asked, "I nearly forgot how's Clara been doing?" He didn't answer, and up until I turned car off, I could see his scowl lingering within the outskirts of my vision. While Maddox kept a continuous rotation of guys on guard duty, it was Mason they said Clara would ask for. From what I heard, he had caved in sometime yesterday, but that was the extent of the whispered rumor. Annoying as ever, which is the only reason she keeps asking for me. His lips flattened into a thin line. A flash of warm blonde hair had me dropping the subject. Cassidy trotted up to the side of the car and leaned against the hood as Mason and I got out. The wavy strands of her hair were pulled into a high ponytail and the workout shorts she wore were low on her hips. "Ah, this is so exciting!" she squealed, her eyes brightening like an oasis caught beneath the sun's rays. "Can you tell none of my friends like training? I'm all alone here." "If they don't train, what do they do?" Mason asked. "Mostly party." She giggled like it were obvious and toyed with the baby pink water bottle in her hands. "Catch them in a fight and all they'll do is pull your hair out. I'd much rather learn to kick some, as Cassidy and Mason struck up a conversation about the different fighting styles we were covering in class, I scoured the parking lot for Brianna. There was no sign of the slate grey sedan Maddox had loaned to her and Giovanni, and as the minutes passed I found my prior excitement dwindle into worry. "Hey, it's about time to go in. Is everything all right with Brianna? She's still coming, isn't she?" Cassidy's giddy tone faltered as she took in my expression. Slipping into Brianna's head was a little easier since the two of us had little in the way of boundaries. Our friendship was all or nothing, not that either of us minded. The things we had both gone through, they were bound to link us together. "Hey, you're still coming to training, right?" Her reaction rocked through my head like the aftershock of an earthquake. There was no horrified shriek, even though I did feel her startle a bit. You scared me. Got a knock first or something?" Her thoughts were like little shreds of paper tossed into the air, each one falling at its own pace. They were jumbled and smushed together without any sort of organization, which I thought fit my best friend perfectly. "Training, right? I'm on my way now, just running late. Needed another cup of coffee to get myself out of bed." An image flashed in my head, one Brianna clearly meant to keep to herself. While there wasn't a single drop of coffee involved, I did get a colorful image of Brianna and Giovanni, who was the real cause for her tardiness. "Coffee, right?" I held back my snicker. "You better hurry, we're about to head inside now. Cassidy says you still have another 10 minutes to get here." "Don't worry, the GPS says I'll be there in 5. Even her thoughts were loud, throwing themselves at me as though she were shouting. When the deafening sound of some pop song roared in my head, I severed the link. The Capitol's training hall was rumored to be one of the best in the country, and from looks alone it lived up to its reputation. A bronze statuette of a wolf sat out front. The great beast was perched on the edge of a cliff, howling its pain and agony into the air. The piece was a memorial dedicated to the wolves whose names were etched onto the cliff's surface. It reminded everyone who passed through these doors that the life of a warrior was hard-earned, fought for with every breath and beat. An undertone of sweat and blood hung in the air, familiar as it dredged up memories of Chris, and how we'd spend hours beneath the blistering sun, fighting until dehydration brought me to my knees. The scent grew stronger as Cassidy and I headed inside, leaving Mason to chat with a group of guys in his class. Minutes ticked by, each one thinning my patience until every other second I found myself glancing at the door, tempted to peek through the rectangular window that looked out into the hall. In the back of my head I could hear the instructor assigning us our partners for the season. Even Cassidy's excited voice, telling me we'd been paired together, couldn't pull my eyes away from the door or my thoughts away from Brianna. Chapter 149. She's not answering me. I tried to sigh, but it was hard to do in my current position. Cassidy's pouty frown and furrowed eyebrows flipped upside down as she bent forward and brought her head in between her legs. As I did the same, her expression was flipped right side up. Each of us were in the same pose, stretching our hamstrings as we mixed our own routine with the recommendations of our trainer. Amelia carried an air of intimidation as she walked into the room, but it melted away the moment her tan lips lifted into a welcoming smile. Her voice was a steady soprano that provided instruction and endless encouragement, despite her height and broad shoulders. It was unsurprising that she towered over me, but she had almost every male in the room beat as well. A jolt of excitement danced in my stomach when she pulled the oversized t-shirt she wore over her head, and I saw the muscle that coated her body. Any decent warrior could see her commitment and perseverance through the definition of her muscles. It was clear Amelia had the strength and poise of a warrior, which made me even more excited to see her skill. I wondered if AKR lurked behind her soft jawline and large hazel eyes. We were both sprawled out on the floor, reaching forwards to touch our toes when Cassidy whispered, "Hey, mind link me real quick." Her eyes darted to Amelia, who had her attention on the students she was helping. Her hand gestured to various parts of the body as she explained various warm-up stretches. Her ear was in our direction, but there was no telling if she was listening or not. "Everything all right?" I lifted an eyebrow at her. Cassidy's head was a luxury walk-in closet filled to the brim with every article of clothing, and accessory a she-wolf could want. Instead of jewelry there were glittering dreams plucked from her subconscious, and razor-sharp nightmares took the place of expensive stilettos. Becoming Luna is what led to this development, but it wasn't one wildly talked about. There wasn't anything particularly useful about seeing the well-oiled or crumbling structure of a pack member's psyche. Just a bit of gossip really, she trailed off, and mischievousness lightened the cerulean tones in her eyes until they reminded me of a clear oasis. "With all the dirt you have on everyone, why hasn't Maddox made you into some kind of super spy?" I teased, crossing an arm over my chest to stretch my triceps. The muscles groaned from not being used in so long. "Oh, because I'm useless at sneaking around. Even Brandon would make a better spy." Her laughter was like a twinkling bell, which was cut short when a flash of guilt crossed her face. She brushed the wispy strands of her bangs back from her face. "I'm not telling you this to dredge anything up, but I feel like you still know so little about some of the people in town, people Maddox and I grew up alongside." There were times where Cassidy reminded me of my ex-best friend Chelsea. Well, she was never really a best friend, but that wasn't important. Both were blonde, though Cassidy's looked to be natural while Chelsea's came from the snooty salon down the street, and both had that sun-kissed, family vacation at our beach house vibe. It was their personalities that really set them apart. Chelsea couldn't spell sincerity, let alone successfully paint it across her face. I'd seen Cassidy display an array of emotions, and each one seemed just as true as the next. Even now, the honesty on her face was evident in the worried line her lips created and the indecision burning in her eyes. "Oh, just tell me. You look like you're about to explode." I kept my voice playful even though she did have me curious. Gossiping was one of the many things Chelsea and I didn't have in common, but in this situation I figured the more information I collected, the better. "I do, don't I? I've always been keeping things in, but I am an excellent secret keeper in case you ever need to make use of me." She winked, then quickly got down to business. Her eyes narrowed into little slits, and I could feel her thoughts flitting a million miles per minute. "So way back when, Amelia had a thing for Maddox. Like, big time. I'm talking more than just A&E in a notebook type of thing. She used to hang around us a lot, but one day she just stopped. If you want my take on things, I think he shot her down and she got upset." A flare of jealousy roared to life inside of Maya, but even she wasn't rash enough to brazenly maul a random she-wolf. I couldn't help but turn my head and look at Amelia, at her bun of her russet-colored curls when I shifted my eyes down an inch and found her staring at me. The last thing I expected was a surprised but warm smile to tug at the corners of her lips. Even her eyes crinkled, and the sight was so genuine that I couldn't help but return the gesture. It was the way that friendliness vanished when her eyes slid to Cassidy that had me feeling a bit confused. "She doesn't seem too torn up about him anymore," I said in Amelia's defense, who was now back to helping other students, her full attention on coaching them through warm-up. "Oh, I can't imagine she would be. The lucky BH found her mate last spring, and of course they're adorable together." She huffed and blew a strand of hair from her face. With a dramatic swipe of her hand, her pout vanished and was replaced with a teasing grin. "I'm only stating facts since bitterness creates wrinkles. Our conversation collapsed as Amelia took the head of the class and began speaking loudly. She did a quick run through of the muscles in the body and followed with stretches for each. We were only halfway through warm-up, but I was seconds away from ditching to track down Brianna since she couldn't answer a simple mind link. Either her thoughts were too chaotic and disorganized to focus, or something bad had happened to her. I felt uneasiness in the pits of my stomach, almost like I were missing something. Still, it wasn't anything like the feeling of knives twisting into my gut when Tristan said those chilling words. "You want me to come with you?" Cassidy asked, keeping her voice low. "I don't mind ditching to help you find Brianna." I thought over her offer, but before I could take her up on it, I heard a familiar huff from down the hall. Cassidy gave me a funny look since I had opened my mouth to respond and quickly shut it, but it was fleeting since seconds later Brianna came bursting through the door. With her hair disheveled and her cheeks flushed, she took a deep breath and said, "So sorry, car broke down." "It's all right, you didn't miss much. We have one other student that's absent for today, so you'll be partnering with me. I'll make sure you get caught up." Amelia nodded, her eyes understanding as she scribbled something onto her clipboard and officially began today's class. I caught a glimpse at what made Amelia qualified to teach when she launched into a brief introduction of Krav Maga. Chris drilled every punch, kick, and hold into my head until I could recite them by heart while also not getting me kicked. After enough leg takedowns and elbow strikes to the liver, both of which hurt worse the next day, I learned I memorized things quickly when under pressure. I also learned I'd do just about anything to kick Chris even once. We didn't do much sparring, but what little we did showed me no matter how she felt about Amelia, she truly was paying attention. I could tell she was holding back, if not from the playful twinkle in her eyes, then from the persistent nudge in my gut. Any time that look crossed her face, I'd smirk and silently dare her to push harder. She didn't take the bait, but it did make class interesting. "You could have answered my mind link, you know." Brianna wiped the sweat from her forehead as she scolded me. The second Amelia called training to an end, she made a beeline for me. I had to leave the car Maddox loaned me on the side of the road, then I hitchhiked. Do you know how many women go missing while hitchhiking? I blinked at her. "I've been trying to mind link you up until you walked through the door, there's no way I would have ignored you." As all the midday classes let out, Cassidy decided to stay behind and catch up with a few acquaintances from another training group. My question about her date with Lars was right on the tip of my tongue, but there hadn't been a moment where the two of us were alone. If I told her my suspicions and someone else were to hear, it could easily spell disaster. She promised to catch up in a few minutes, but I was beginning to learn how easily she could get distracted. "You didn't ignore me." She frowned, and for some reason that seemed to trouble her more. I shook my head and said sincerely, "I'd never." "You know, I mind-linked Mason too and didn't get an answer. I figured he must have gotten distracted, it wouldn't be the first time. I knew when you didn't answer something was up." The fear that flashed across her face was all too familiar. When she spoke her voice was low. "You don't think the witches were trying to kill me again, do you? Or what if they're trying to mess with our mind link so we can't talk to each other when they finally do AK? Maybe I shouldn't go with Joe, maybe it's safer here." Feeling myself pale, I hopped onto the trunk of the car and watched streams of warriors in training as they exited through the two sets of double doors. From there they fanned out across the vast parking lot. "Those are both good points, I just wish there was a way of knowing for sure. I think you might be safer going with him and getting far away from me and this pack for a few days." I never had a hard time telling Brianna the truth, but telling her she'd be safer by leaving me behind, it was a little hard to swallow. Hopefully, Holly sees something that gets us the upper hand, because until I learn some real magic, I have no clue how to stop them. I won't be gone for long, you can count on that. We'll figure this out together and I'll be at your side through it all. Even if you weren't my best friend, you're the vampire queen. You and Joe are essentially a package deal, which sounds a little strange now that I think about it. She narrowed her eyes playfully, and slowly the emotion simmered into something familiar and calming. There was something I wanted to ask you before we left. I only remember bits and pieces. So, I wanted to know, what exactly happened last night? Brianna sensed the change in my demeanor instantly and sank her teeth into her lower lip, something she did only when she was nervous. I slid from the trunk of the car, too consumed by guilt to stick a graceful landing. Look, I know it has something to do with the shadows, she said with furrowed eyebrows, lowering her voice dramatically towards the end. I just don't remember anything else, and I'd like to know every detail considering I almost died. The fact that she knew did little to deflate the balloon pressing against my insides, slowly suffocating me until all I could see was red. Instead I nodded numbly, because why wouldn't she want to know? When are you leaving? Some of the severity left her face and she managed a small but genuine smile. It hinted at her fear and her budding excitement over meeting her mate's family. Tomorrow, which is why you and I are having a sleepover tonight. Oh, and it's taking place at your fancy new house, so tell Maddox to make himself scarce. Her lips twitched into a playful smirk. I heard something about making Maddox scarce and knew I needed in on the conversation. Cassidy's laughter sounded from a few cars away, and slowly she came into view. She spotted Brianna and her cheerful expression brightened. I'm so glad you were able to make it. I'm horrible with cars, but you could have always mind-linked me for a ride. I'm awful with them too, I think that's why I got all frazzled when it started filling with smoke. I couldn't piece my thoughts together, let alone mind-link anyone. Brianna lied smoothly, and I know I'd have to do the same. I tried not to anticipate the sour taste it left in my mouth. A thought popped into my head, and I asked on a whim, how did you get here if you had to ditch the car? It's a long story, one I'll explain tonight. Her voice jumped an octave, and I knew there was something she was leaving out. Oh, I knew I heard something about a sleepover. Cassidy squealed, then dropped her voice to a whisper as Brianna shushed her. She held back her laughter as she quietly asked, "Can I come?" "Of course you can," I replied quickly, then mind-linked Brianna to let her know I'd explain on the way to the witch's house. It was smartest to get Cassidy within the safety of the house before asking about Lars. With all the wandering ears in this pack, someone was bound to hear. All it would take was a single mind link and he could have enough of a head start to slip through the boundaries. Brianna and I were seconds away from taking off when I noticed Amelia through the dwindling crowd. Her eyes scanned the crowd and stopped on my face. She walked with purpose and took long strides past the crowd until we were feet away. "Glad I caught up to you before you left. It's an honor to have you in my class, Luna. I'm eager to see if you live up to your reputation, same goes for you, even if you did show up late." It was the respect in her eyes that surprised me most, and the way it brightened the splotches of gold and green within them. If it weren't for the wide smile she flashed Brianna, I wouldn't have noticed the way it dropped when her eyes settled on Cassidy. "I'll see you in class tomorrow, Cassidy." "See you tomorrow, Emmy," Cassidy replied, and the venom she laced into the nickname told me it wasn't for endearment. Amelia's eyes hardened into stakes of black wood, but she said nothing as she turned on her heel and walked away. "Do you trust her?" Brianna asked once I finished explaining my plan, her filled with simple curiosity. It took me a moment to answer truthfully. I listened to the soothing hum of the road as I debated on what words to say. We still had a few minutes until we reached Rowena's, which meant I had plenty of time to think. No, but I'd like to someday. I know so little about her, which is partially my fault because I could have easily asked Maddox anything I want to know, but I didn't want to come off as weird and suspicious. Oh, I have no problems coming off as weird and suspicious. I want to know every woman that's ever batted their eyelashes at Joe. Brianna wrinkled her nose, and quickly the two of us descended into laughter. The light-hearted mood we set in the car lasted the entire ride, up until we walked into the witch's house and saw Grandma in the kitchen, her eyes lit with a soft lavender glow. Chapter 150. You tell anyone, and you won't see a cent of your inheritance when I'm gone. Grandma narrowed her eyes, but the frown that tugged at her lips made the flimsy threat ineffective. I didn't even know we had an inheritance. I snorted as I stood at her side in the kitchen. Like I had hundreds of times when we lived in the little cottage, I began gathering the bowls and pans that collected in the sink as she baked. A thin layer of silence settled over us, one that reminded me of long days training with Chris and cherry pies that sat on the windowsill to cool. So, you don't want me to tell anyone you were here or that you were here and using magic? She swatted at me with a rag until I chuckled and moved away from the sink. Brianna finished putting the rest of the dried dishes away and perched herself on the edge of the counter, her eyes curious and eager. Her obvious love of magic made a whisper of a smile cross my face. No, it's not that. It turns out Rowena was right, I've been using magic to make my baking better, and for all these years, her features contorted into a scowl that made my chest begin to throb. She looked around at the various plates of cookies and exhaled sharply, as though they were to blame for greedily taking the magic from her overworked hands. I won the Kenworth County Fair's pie baking competition 4 years in a row. 4 years. I'm a fraud. Are you joking right now? Brianna made an indignant sound and slid off the counter. Her voice took on the same lecturing tone as my mom's when I'd sneak in past curfew. You have actual magic, and you've been using it for decades without even knowing. You're not a fraud, Grandma. You're a badass. I gave in to the grin that tugged at my lips. Nothing I say could top that. You think so? Her frown remained, but some of its harshness faded. There's nothing I love doing more than baking well, that and tending to my garden. I suppose it makes a certain amount of sense that I was using my magic for both of those things. Maybe that's part of the reason why you love doing them, because it's the only time you get to fully embrace yourself. Brianna's eyes softened and warmed like the gooey center of Grandma's chocolate chip cookies. Grandma's smile was thankful, and I knew from the glossiness of her eyes she'd need a moment to respond. When she finally did speak, she didn't disappoint. If I'm not a fraud, that means there's no reason to give them trophies back. The lines surrounding her mouth and eyes faded as the tension seemed to drain from her small frame. A twinkle of mischief danced in her eyes, their st out of luck for the $1,000 cashier's checks, though. Thanks to Brianna's blunt but much-needed words, Grandma relaxed enough to tell us more about the magic she felt stirring in her bones. It was only a little disheartening to hear her say how familiar it felt, like an old friend she'd been waiting so long to meet. It was Maya that stopped my self-doubt in its tracks and set me back on course. She reminded me that Grandma's magic hadn't been locked away like ours. It had always been there, but only emerged when she stepped into the kitchen or garden, 2 places that brought her insurmountable joy. I had no doubt that the magic she created was masked by the love and care she put into every dessert and plant in her garden. I still don't have a clue what I'm doing, but Rowena's been kind enough to give me a hand. Grandma spoke over her shoulder as she darted through the kitchen like a hummingbird. Only Rowena, what about Cordelia? I questioned. Apparently I'm a natural. Grandma replied, a hint of awkwardness in her voice. She quickly moved on from her baking spree and started this new mission of hers by pulling out a pack of ground beef and other Tupperware containers from the refrigerator. Brianna hovered around her almost protectively once she started grabbing the ingredients to make lasagna. I'd nearly forgotten about Rowena and Cordelia until I saw the size of the baking dish Grandma pulled from the cabinet. They'll be here shortly. Rowena needed some supplies, and it turns out Cordelia did as well, so she tagged along. The two of them said something about a local occult shop. Grandma replied in between measuring batches of flour for the garlic rolls. When she had her back turned, Brianna scooped another spoonful of minced garlic into the butter. Us garlic girls have to stick together. She grinned behind Grandma's back, her voice smug as it traveled down the mind link. For sure. I swallowed my laughter, but it was impossible to hold it for long when I could see the amused smirk that painted my grandma's face. Rowena had been inside the house a total of 2 minutes when she hefted a massive leather-bound book into the living room and dropped it square on the coffee table. As she cracked it open and the smell of old paper filled the air, I was surprised to see how well preserved each page was. I looked up in time to see the shrewd look Cordelia gave Rowena, but within the blink of an eye it was gone. She looked as she always did, her features bright and soft, her slender frame draped with fabrics and dainty crystal necklaces. An odd feeling ran down my spine, like the trail a drop of rain made as it trickled down a pane of glass. The sensation vanished when Brianna leaned forward and cooed, "Oh, this is beautiful." "It is, isn't it?" It was a gift from the little girl I grew up with, one she would have been beaten for if her mother had caught her. Luckily, I've always known how to keep a secret and appreciate an incredible gift. Her smile was the color of rubies and matched her newly painted nails. She trailed it along the slender script that filled almost the entirety of the page. "I loved this book as a child. It broke everything down in a way I could understand at the time. Consider this book the foundation of your training. It'll tell you the 7 types of magic, but not how they are manipulated, or the endless ways they can manifest in a young witch. You'll come to realize trying to fit any of us into a box doesn't work well. Like everything else in this world, magic is ever evolving, only it moves at a much faster pace." While Maya sulked that our first official day of witch practice wasn't on creating magical tidal waves or making trees explode from the ground, Brianna and I hunkered behind the billowing pages of Rowena's ancient textbook and devoured every word until our eyes grew dry. It jumped right into the first type of magic, one Cordelia happened to be familiar with. Protection magic was considered one of the smaller and more refined magics, but its chapter was over 70 pages long. Divination came in close second at 102 pages. Rowena had been right, there was no way to track the endless possibilities that came with a subject as broad as protection magic. The book covered as many variations as it could, darting between protective shields and mentally enhanced barriers, only to completely veer off the map by including warriors made of marble and coal as an example. As Cordelia helped Grandma in the kitchen, and the hearty scent of tomato sauce and herbs filled the air, she also shouted answers to any questions Brianna or I asked. Technically, yes. It qualifies as protection magic. Her confirmation didn't ease my surprise. If anything, it made the images in my head much more outlandish. A very rare type of it, mind you. Even I've never seen anything like it. Oh, divination. That's the kind of magic I'd have if I were a witch. She grinned sheepishly, her finger falling from where it hovered over the second chapter. The magic Brianna eagerly claimed ranged from visions, mystical prophecies, and crystal BS to seeing the precise moment of a person's age through touch alone. Where protection magic was precise, divination was sprinkled with chaos. If only more species had that kind of mindset, there wouldn't have been so many of us KD during the trials. Rowena shook her head sadly, even though pride shone in her eyes when they landed on Brianna's radiant face. I'm happy to see our kind working together, even if there are other witches who wish to disrupt that peace. The dark turn of conversation tugged my mind in the direction of Lars, who Maddox and Zeke had yet to find. Can there be male witches? I asked. When Brianna's eyes flickered my way, I fumbled for an excuse that wasn't entirely a lie. If there's a chance the infiltrators are men, then we know to broaden our search. Rowena smiled kindly and said, I hope you take this as a comfort, but only women can wield magic. When we do have children, rarely is it a boy. Even though her tone was soft and meant to reassure, her words had an unintended effect on me. No matter how far into the future this was, I couldn't help picturing my own child latched onto my arm. It wasn't a bouncing baby boy I saw, but a little girl. Her bright, honey-toned eyes smiling and giggling up at Maddox. What should have brought me feelings of euphoria left me ripe with worry, because if Maddox and I had a daughter, she'd never be allowed to rule. No matter how far werewolves had come, there wasn't a single pack in the world that challenged this ancient law. Chapter 151. It was when we reached the third chapter of Rowena's book that Cordelia's knowledge came into play. The chapter on sigils and their unique brand of magic was one of the longest in the book. Sigils tie into the other forms of magic since there's a symbol for just about everything. There are ones to scare off enemies, capture memories, and fool the human eye. There are a few witches, who after decades of practice, manage to create their own, but it's dangerous and tricky work. Cordelia said as she entered the room, a small and unassuming book in her hand. So, a sigil that's meant to shield someone from an enemy has protection magic mixed in with it? Brianna questioned. She'd deny it vehemently, but it was clear she got her love of magic and myths from her scholarly parents. For the most part, yes. Let's say you're exceptional with sigils. You should be able to use ones that vary in their effects. Protection, elemental manipulation, illusions, it's all at your fingertips if you have enough power. On the other hand, if you're a seasoned witch who specializes in protective magic, the only sigil you'd be able to successfully pull off is one in your field. Cordelia explained, and both Brianna and I nodded along as the pieces clicked together in our heads. Not that I don't love being a werewolf, but I wouldn't have minded some magical powers. Brianna sighed dramatically and sunk into the couch. While I giggled alongside Cordelia, I knew there was some part of her that wasn't joking. Without her wolf, she was essentially a ridiculously strong human with enhanced senses. I've used a healing sigil or two in the past and they worked like a charm, never tried any other kind though. Rowena's head of glossy auburn hair appeared from around the corner. Her ruby nails were tearing one of Grandma's garlic knots in half as she spoke. My mother would tell me all about what happened to little witches that tried to cast big spells out of their skill set, never ends well. On that note, I'd like you to have this. Cordelia shook her head at Rowena for trying to scare me off, but little did they know there wasn't anything anyone could do to knock me off this path. If magic meant protecting my friends, family, and pack, then sign me up, risks included. Take this book home with you, study the sigils and their meanings. It's a beginner's guide, so you shouldn't be able to drain yourself into a coma if you try one out. The cover was bound in plum-colored velvet, which was soft as it brushed against my fingertips. This time I did pale, and much to my surprise, so did Brianna. Grandma cleared her throat from in the kitchen. She came around the corner and stood in the doorway, her hands firmly planted on her hips. I feel like I should have been made aware of this before you had me start using magic. she said to Rowena, whose immediate look of understanding took some of the ire out of her words. This isn't a risk for more experienced witches, or ones that have been unknowingly using their magic for well over 40 years. Rowena replied with a reassuring smile. I doubt it'll be a problem for Lola either, it's more of a precaution for young children with little impulse control. Better safe than sorry considering we have no clue how powerful she is or where her skill set lies. Cordelia swiveled her eyes away from Rowena, and her expression quickly shifted from scrutiny to amusement. Don't think I don't remember how it was to be a young witch. You can't imagine how much trouble magic can get you in. I might be able to imagine more than you think. My laughter was light as my thoughts strayed to the shadows that fled when I came near. They hadn't yet come out since the sun was still bright in the sky, but soon they would. The five of us talked as we ate, though the conversation was mostly carried by Rowena and Cordelia's steady influx of knowledge on magic. Even Grandma threw in a question or two, mostly pertaining to her own magic, which she and Rowena had yet to discover. The specifics of your magic and its uniqueness is completely up to you to discover. You've already made incredible progress by learning to call it forward instead of only being able to use it subconsciously. Cordelia snagged the plates before Grandma got the chance and winked when she noticed my creeping grin. She paused on her walk to the kitchen and said not unkindly, only an incredibly powerful witch could hold onto her magic for as long as you have. Not only that, but you've been using it all this time without knowing. I can't say I've read anything about this happening before. I haven't either, but that makes it even more exciting. As a fellow natural, it's my duty to help you come into your own. Plus, I've never met one that's put their magic into food. Rowena's eagerness turned her cheeks the color of gala apples. Her dedication to helping my grandma discover herself in this new world brought a feeling of relief I couldn't explain. Grandma, who shifts once a week only to traipse through the forest to give her wolf a breath of fresh air, now had a way to defend herself. Well, I've got to head out. Grandma murmured to the four of us as she wandered around the living room in search for her purse and car keys. I want to beat your dad back home or else her mouth clamped shut the same moment my head popped up from the book. Rarely ever was Grandma distracted, but discovering a secret witch heritage is bound to throw anyone off their game. From the guilty look on her face she knew there was no shrugging her comment off. Where's Dad? I asked smoothly, not at all trying to hide my interest as I slowly set the book down. Your father is out for coffee, and that's all I'm saying on the matter. I will see you all tomorrow, I assume. She nodded once and made a beeline for the front door. Every time I looked back on this moment, I remembered feeling an intense desire to know the truth. Grandma's never had a reason to keep anything from me other than my vampire heritage, but I've long forgiven her and Dad for that. When she made a move towards the front door without so much as an explanation, something inside of me lashed out. That thing didn't want her to leave. I didn't want her to leave. My eyes were still on Grandma's face when the lock on the front door clicked shut, followed by the loud snap of the deadbolt. The tips of my fingers tingled like I'd touched an exposed wire. Grandma froze and the hand that hovered a few inches away from the doorknob fell to her side. Everyone was looking my way, but I wouldn't give in to the curious stares that painted their faces, even though Brianna's star-struck expression paired with her open mouth made me want to cackle. Lola, Grandma scolded me, but I could tell she didn't know what to do in this situation. Her voice lacked the fiery wrath that would fill it when she was thoroughly pissed off. Dad's getting coffee at 6 in the afternoon? I asked, holding back every ounce of my skepticism because Grandma could tell how implausible it sounded without. He doesn't even drink coffee. No, but Flora does, and if you breathe a word of this in his direction you'll live to regret it, hear me. Her jaw was set in the same stubborn way as Dad's often did. Where I should have felt cautious, a jolt of giddiness washed through me. The flash of heat that flickered in her eyes was surrounded by a gentle lavender glow. Grandma blinked a few times and the fire vanished as though it had never been there. I wondered what her magic felt like, if it tingled her nerves like jolts of electricity, or exploded like fireworks beneath her skin. "He's with Flora getting coffee." Surprise washed through me, carrying away the small bursts of magic I swore I'd been feeling. "Yes, and he doesn't want anyone to know about it." Her eyebrows softened. "You know how your dad is. He's not going to admit how much he wants this by asking for help, but he's also terrified he's going to mess it all up. They're meeting in person, which is a start. We won't say a word," I promised her, letting a smile hold back the questions that hid behind my lips. There were two that were almost painful to silence. Something changed between them since the bake sale, where they orbited closer and closer to one another only to back away. I longed to ask what happened if only to fill the blanks in my head. My second question was much more important, and it was one I knew I'd get the answer to soon enough. Who asked first? Chapter 152. After promising another 3 times, Grandma finally left to beat Dad home. He had no clue she'd overheard him talking to Flora on the phone and found out about their get-together, even though he should have realized you can't hide anything from Grandma. Rowena slipped away to her bedroom after making me swear an oath I'd tell her, or Cordelia should something like that happen again. She left the 3 of us to eat Grandma's leftovers and brush through various sigil books. Beneath each hand-drawn symbol was a tip to help make the spell stronger. Many called for white chalk or paint, others wanted black, and the harsher sigils called for animal blood. Some of the symbols became so complex my eyes couldn't discern where one line began and another ended. There was one sigil that sent my thoughts veering towards the marks on my neck. It wasn't Maddox's on my mind, even though I showed off the cobalt mark every chance I had. Unfortunately, in doing so I also had no choice but to show off my other mark, the one belonging to Tristan. The dull cold that clung to it made it almost impossible to forget. "Since you're good with sigils, you wouldn't happen to know anything about removing a vampire's mating mark." It was impossible to keep my voice light after voicing a question like that. I settled for an awkward and drawn-out laugh. "I know the two aren't related, in a way, they are. A mating mark binds you and another person on a spiritual level, and just like a sigil it won't stray from its purpose. On the other hand, a sigil fades or vanishes once the spell reaches completion, whereas a mating mark is for life." My stomach was twisting and turning, riding the waves of my hope as it ebbed and flowed. It crashed into the rocky shore when Cordelia said, "As for how to remove it, there isn't a magical remedy I know of that I can tell you, but if I may ask, has he tried marking someone else?" "He doesn't exactly have someone else to mark." I grimaced. No matter how desperate I was to get this thing off my neck, I wouldn't pass it to another unwilling soul. "Right, well, I'll see if there's any spells or sigils that have to do with mating marks. In the meantime you should focus on your magic. The more attention you give it, the easier it should be to take control. After all, you can't train a dog you never spend time with." When her eyes crinkled with sympathy my hope vanished, leaving me to succumb to the waves. 45 minutes later, in a quick but steamy conversation with Maddox through MindLink, I found myself sandwiched between the wall and his sweaty muscular form. Nights ago he clasped a hand over my mouth and smirked as my moans were muffled against his flesh. Tonight was different in many ways. Either he could see the stress in my eyes and knew I was nearing my breaking point, or he was nearing one of his own, because the second he walked through the door, he attacked. His hands were greedy, squeezing and pulling as they sought out my warmest, wettest areas. It was a good thing all I wore were baggy workout clothes because within seconds they were scraps of fabric that littered the floor. He coaxed every single scream from my lips while his rough hands wound themselves in my hair, and his feral tongue explored my mouth. He hadn't let me, and I'd been trying again. I could do nothing but thrash against him as I whimpered and cried out the last of my frustration. "So, Cassidy's coming to this sleepover of yours?" Maddox raised an eyebrow from where he sat propped against the headboard. The sight of his chest and bulging arms was delicious, and it was that soreness that sent me floating back down to earth. "You sound surprised." I chuckled as I rummaged through the drawer for a change of clothes and glanced up at the vanity mirror where I met his eyes. The clothes I had been wearing currently covered the living room floor in the form of homemade confetti. At some point we made it to the bedroom, which meant any piece of clothing not protected by a door now had an undertone of S*X that clung to its fibers. "I know how Cassidy is. She never struck me as your type. Then again, you were close with that blonde back in your hometown. You looked stunning wearing that black dress. I can see why Chelsea stood in front of you in every photo." There wasn't an ounce of shame or decency in his honey-flecked eyes, just that air of confidence that seemed utterly impenetrable. His lips twitched as surprise rippled across my face. I was curious, so I found pictures from that night. It was hard to believe you grew up with that tool with how much you glared at him in every photo. I cracked a smile. He kept saying I looked gothic like it was an insult. "And what do you mean you didn't think she was my type?" Maddox's towering form appeared behind me, a dark shadow that scooped me off my feet and tossed me onto the bed. I landed with a light thud, giggling as he hovered over me and effectively caged me in. "Gothic? He should have been KD for saying you looked anything short of perfect." He snorted, sending a puff of warm air against my neck from where his nose trailed along the soft skin. "As for Cassidy, she can be shallow and self-centered. Material things matter to her, and embarrassment is a betrayal. She'll spend the rest of her life punishing you for something I do not speak from experience on, but I've met plenty who have." While I wanted to know more about Cassidy's vengeful side, the confidence in which he spoke about me made my face flush with heat. "I think I'm curious too, and unfortunately I'm not resourceful enough to scour the internet for pictures of you," I chuckled weakly, then took a quick breath before I could back down. "What was it like growing up here? How was your childhood with Cassidy and Brandon?" When his eyes darkened and some of the golden tones faded, I knew his mind had gone somewhere unpleasant. The weight of his expression lifted when I wrapped my arms around his neck and held myself against his chest. "Things were normal when we were kids. We'd play, and get in trouble." He half shrugged, then ran a hand through his hair because he knew my silence meant I was waiting for a better answer. "Cassidy was an outsider for a while. She'd mostly trail after Brandon and I, but somehow she ended up a part of our group. Training started during my pre-teens, which took up a good bit of time. I couldn't do as much anymore, couldn't play sports or hang out after school. It caused a rift between the three of us for a little while. When I left for your pack, Cassidy stayed in touch, but by that point Brandon and I already cut ties." "That sounds rough, to be isolated from everyone like that." I knew Maddox wouldn't want sympathy, yet I couldn't help but feel bad for the child that he'd once been. It didn't take a gut feeling to know he was holding back. While there weren't any salacious memories with Cassidy that stood out, there was plenty with Brandon that still stung him like an old wound. "So you and her never," I trailed off, feeling my breath hitch when his eyes settled on my lower lip. His thumb forced the swollen flesh from between my teeth where I'd been chewing on it. My eyes fluttered shut when his tongue grazed the indent my canine left. "Have her and I ever," he trailed off, his voice low as it rumbled from his throat. "Kissed? Dated? Phew, yes, All of the above. I hissed and tried to pull my head away when his teeth sunk into my lower lip, right on the spot I'd been biting. Ever so gently, he let go. He held back the need that darkened his eyes long enough for adoration and love to shine through. It made the gold return to his eyes, and I watched as it rippled and multiplied. When men like Maddox were fortunate enough to fall in love, it consumed every fiber of their being, plagued every nightmare and dream until the voice that spoke in their head was that of their beloved. It was terrifying to feel that in another person, especially an alpha whose instincts play a hand in every decision made. It was a tightrope these men walked, a precarious balance between unconditional love and unbridled obsession. Join our Facebook and WhatsApp group for more updates, link is given in description. Rest audiobook will be continued in next episode.